In a quiet two-bedroom house nestled in the heart of the Rose Hill neighborhood, where the walls were painted by the hands of an independent woman, a seemingly harmless dinner became an irreversible turning point. This wasn't a story about a typical family argument or a generational disagreement. It was a wake-up call about manipulation disguised as affection, about how trust can be twisted into a weapon to seize control of someone's life. Elena Hartwell had no idea that in the very kitchen where she baked pies from her grandmother's recipe, her own relatives were quietly conspiring to take everything she had built. This wasn't just a story about property. It was a journey of peeling back the masks within a family where love always came with conditions and freedom was paid for with solitude. Yet from within that wound, a woman stood up, learned how to set boundaries, and held on to the most precious thing of all, the right to own her life. Elena Hartwell stood by the kitchen window, her hands still streaked with white paint, eyes fixed on the sunset dyeing the quiet rooftops of Rose Hill in hues of deep red. Just 3 years ago, this place had felt like a distant dream, a charming house with oak floors, a dark green tiled porch, and a small garden just big enough for a few rows of lavender. But now it was her reality. The first home she had bought entirely on her own, with her savings, without family loans, without joint ownership, and free of any unwanted strings. As a financial consultant at Davenport Capital, Elena had spent nearly a decade climbing the ladder from contract analyst to senior advisor. She had given up every weekend, turned down holiday breaks to meet project deadlines, and stayed up entire nights redoing forecasts over a single incorrect figure. No one saw, no one applauded, but she kept going because it was the only way out from the overwhelming shadow of a family that always made her feel she wasn't enough. Elena had grown up in a household where control was labeled as protection. Her father, Harold, was a man of unrelenting principles who once forbade her from wearing sleeveless tops because they didn't look proper, while her mother, Janice, constantly reminded her that a good girl is one who stays quiet and listens. She never rebelled, only quietly collected every small thing she would one day use to escape. The day she placed a deposit on the house in Rose Hill, her parents never came to see it. They simply repeated that she should get an apartment closer to home so they could keep an eye on her, or asked, why not just stay and build another floor? But she had chosen this house, a house with a kitchen big enough to cook recipes she'd taught herself from YouTube, with a small office and a window overlooking an old oak tree where she wrote million-dollar strategy reports. And that Sunday evening, as she prepared a celebratory dinner of red wine braised beef and fragrant baked apple tart to mark her promotion and welcome her parents, she believed things would be different. She believed, even if only a little, that her brilliant success might finally earn their pride. But Elena had no idea that behind their smiles and the bottle of wine they brought her family had come to declare that house was no longer truly hers. Elena Hartwell's childhood wasn't a series of sorrowful memories, but it had never been fertile ground for freedom either. She grew up in an impeccably tidy house in the Claremont suburbs where every picture frame had to be leveled with a spirit measure, and every action required her parents' unspoken approval. Harold, her meticulous and tight-lipped father, managed everything in the household, like a cold executive, strict schedules, rigid rules, and sky-high expectations. Janice, her mother, whose voice was softer but no less controlling, would smile and describe those limitations as boundaries to keep you from making mistakes. From school uniforms to the list of friends she was allowed to play with, every aspect of Elena's life had been decided for her long before she understood what she actually wanted. Elena didn't rebel. She didn't slam doors or scream for freedom. She simply dreamed quietly of unreachable things and carefully tucked them into a corner of her mind. When it came time to choose a university, she secretly applied to Andersfield State University, nearly 300 miles away, a silent departure. When the acceptance letter and full scholarship arrived, Harold was silent through dinner, while Janice only asked, "Do you really think you can live on your own?" Elena didn't answer. She just packed her bags and for the first time left that house without asking for permission. Those 4 years away from home were the first time Elena truly felt she could breathe. In college, she discovered her talent for financial management, joined the investment planning club, and learned how to handle everything from rent to tuition on her own. She lived in a tiny dorm, worked at the campus library to make ends meet, and still graduated with honors, offered a position at Davenport Capital even before receiving her diploma. Elena never stayed in Claremont for long after that. Short holiday visits were enough to remind her that the peace her parents built was only the facade of a world she no longer belonged to. And perhaps because she had once escaped this time when she thought everything was finally stable and recognized, she let her guard down. Elena had forgotten that Harold and Janice had never truly accepted her as an independent woman, let alone a successful one thriving beyond their control. Control doesn't always arrive in the form of yelling or commands. It often seeps in disguised as harmless concern. Elena began to realize this when her father, Harold, suddenly took an unusual interest in the fine details of her newly purchased home. He asked about her mortgage rate, whether she had chosen a 15 or 30-year term, and if she had considered refinancing now that the market was dropping. At first, she thought he was merely curious, or perhaps looking for an opportunity to offer financial help, even though he never actually did. But over time, his concern became persistent, almost methodical, as if he were collecting data for a plan he hadn't yet revealed. Janice, meanwhile, took a subtler approach. She offered to send over a few heirloom items to Elena's house, explaining that the attic's dampness might ruin them. Antique picture frames, porcelain vases, even the grandfather clock that once hung in their old living room, all began to appear in Elena's space, like invisible anchors trying to hold onto something that no longer belonged to them. She didn't suspect a thing. Instead, she felt guilty. For years, she had tried to prove she wasn't the ungrateful daughter they had once implied. When her parents said they were struggling with property taxes, she sent a check. When their heater broke in the middle of winter, she covered half the replacement cost. She never asked for the money back because in her mind it was simple. They were family. But someone didn't believe it was that simple. Talia Monroe, her best friend from college, who had witnessed Elena's entire journey into adulthood. "They don't want you to surpass them," Talia had once said after seeing her parents' indifferent reaction to Elena's promotion. "They're holding you with obligation and guilt, not love." Elena had just smiled and brushed it off. She had never considered the possibility that her parents, stern but devoted as she had always known them, might be engaging in systemic manipulation. She didn't think twice when her mother asked to keep a spare key in case of emergency. She didn't question her father's request to review her home insurance policy just to make sure you're not overpaying. Each action taken on its own could be seen as a gesture of care. But strung together, they painted a much colder picture. They had never truly seen the house as Elena's alone, but as the family's, as belonging to a daughter who had never really left their grasp. That evening, Elena spent hours in the kitchen preparing a perfect meal. She cooked French-style beef bourguignon, slow-simmered for 3 hours until the meat was tender enough to fall apart with a fork. She mashed potatoes with heavy cream, salted butter, and a touch of nutmeg, just the way her mother Janice used to make them when she was a child. She baked an apple pie from her grandmother's recipe, rolling out the dough by hand and slicing each apple wafer thin with precision. Even the white porcelain plates with silver trim, rarely brought out, were taken from the glass cabinet. Elena wasn't just celebrating her new title, Senior Advisory Director. She was inviting her parents into the world she had built with her own 2 hands. A world of independence without permission, outside the framework they had once imposed. When the doorbell rang at exactly 5 o'clock, Elena adjusted her dress and opened the door with a smile. But that smile quickly faltered when she saw not only Harold and Janice standing there, but also Nathan, her younger brother, hands stuffed in his pockets, standing just behind them with a detached expression. "Nathan didn't have plans tonight, so we brought him along," Janice said, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. "Of course." Elena replied, suppressing her disappointment and quickly recalculating the portions in her mind. Nathan was the kind of person who showed up in every story but never created one of his own, which was exactly why Elena always kept her distance. She felt her space her evening once again being occupied by people who hadn't truly come to celebrate. Dinner began under a strained veil of politeness. Harold commented on the new enamel on the kitchen walls, pointing out a slight bump Elena hadn't had time to sand properly. Janice asked where the new curtains were from and how much they cost, while Nathan scrolled through his phone, occasionally smirking at some text. When the main course was served, Elena poured wine into their glasses and took a deep breath. "I have some good news to share," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "I've just been promoted to Senior Advisory Director at Davenport Capital. It's a significant raise, and I'll now be managing my own client portfolio." A breathless pause fell over the table before Janice spoke. "So that means you'll be working even more. That doesn't sound great for your health." Harold asked a single question. "How much more will you be earning?" Elena answered. The only semblance of congratulations came as, "Well, it's about time someone recognized you." Nathan snorted. "Sitting in air conditioning all day and earning that much. Guess times really have changed." And in that moment, Elena understood that this dinner had never been about celebrating her. It was to set the stage for something far worse. As Elena placed the apple pie on the table and poured coffee into each porcelain cup, she still clung to a faint hope that the atmosphere might soften. But the shift in Harold's posture put her on alert. He sat up straighter, set down his utensils neatly as though preparing to deliver a boardroom address. "Elena," he began, his voice dropping in an uncharacteristically solemn tone, "your mother and I have been thinking a lot about your current situation." She frowned, not yet understanding what situation he was referring to, when Janice interjected, her gaze sweeping across the house with a hint of proprietorship. "This house, truthfully, is a bit much for someone living alone, and it's really a waste if it's only serving one person. It should serve the family." Elena set her coffee cup down, her palms suddenly cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice raspy. Harold tilted his head, serious, as though announcing a carefully considered policy. "I mean, this house needs to return to its rightful value, a shared family asset. You were only able to get it thanks to the family's ongoing investment, from education to upbringing to career guidance. Now it's time for the family to also benefit from the result." Nathan, seated across from her, nodded along as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "We'll start renovations by knocking down the wall between the kitchen and dining room," he said nonchalantly. "Mom's always preferred open spaces." Elena looked at the familiar faces, those who gave birth to her, raised her, and the one she once called a brother, now openly discussing the takeover of the home she had built with her own hands. "This is my house," she said, voice soft but firm. "My name is on the deed. I pay the mortgage every month. No one else contributed a single cent." Harold waved a hand as if brushing away a trivial complaint. "Family, Elena. What's yours is ours. That's how previous generations lived and preserved wealth." Janice pursed her lips, her tone laced with reproach. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you show gratitude. So selfish that you won't even share a roof over your head." A heavy silence blanketed the room. Elena could no longer hear the clink of spoons against plates, could no longer smell the cinnamon in the pie. All that remained was a fracture. A boundary crossed, a message made unmistakably clear. They had never seen her as an independent person, only as an asset producing returns, ready to be claimed when convenient. Elena left the dinner table with legs that barely touched the ground, as if her body were moving while her mind remained behind, trapped, somewhere between her father's cold words and Nathan's indifferent gaze. She carried only her purse, car keys, and phone, leaving behind everything else from a dinner she once believed would be a moment of connection. When the door shut behind her, the early autumn chill of Rose Hill brushed her face, but it wasn't enough to ease the numbness rising from her chest. She drove to Talia's apartment on instinct alone, tears sliding down her cheeks without her noticing. When Talia opened the door, Elena said nothing. She simply collapsed into her friend's arms like a child who'd just been pushed out of her own home. She recounted everything, every word, every nod, every look, devoid of love. They actually believed they could take that house like it was rightfully theirs, she whispered. Talia gripped her shoulders tightly, her eyes fierce with anger. Elena, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is theft. It's premeditated. It's criminal. Elena wanted to argue, to make excuses, to say maybe her parents were just overwhelmed and acting out of desperation. But the phone call the next morning erased any remaining trace of hope. The call came from David Herrera, a representative from Midwest Mortgage Services. His tone was cool and professional as he informed her that a request had been made to change the primary borrower on her mortgage and to add co-owners to the loan submitted the previous night. While Elena had been baking apple pie and lighting candles, her own parents were attempting to gain access to her home loan using her social security number, full name, date of birth, and even her bank email address. Elena stood frozen in Talia's kitchen, the phone slipping from her hand unnoticed. She felt as if every layer of protective skin had been stripped away. The soft words, the familiar hugs, the guilt she had carried for saying no to their requests, now all felt exposed and calculated. They hadn't just wanted her home, they had planned this, and they were willing to impersonate their own daughter to get it. Elena could no longer comfort herself with the illusion of familial love. She needed a lawyer, and she needed a boundary, one she would finally draw for the first time in her life without asking anyone's permission. The law office of Brookstone and Hale was housed in an old marble building near downtown Marston, but as Elena stepped inside, she felt as though she had finally found a space untouched by the manipulation she had just endured. Vanessa Brookstone, a woman with eyes sharp as blades and a voice smooth as silk, sat across from her, listening to a story Elena never imagined herself telling: that her own parents had attempted to seize her house, falsify financial records, and had even taken all her personal documents from her apartment just one day after forcing her out. "They don't just want the house," Vanessa said after a long silence. "They want control over your life, and they're used to getting it without being challenged." Within a few hours, Vanessa's team had uncovered things Elena had never dared to suspect. Her parents, Harold and Janice, were drowning in credit card debt, facing back taxes from the past 2 years, and had recently taken out a second mortgage on their own home. They weren't just in financial trouble, they were desperate. Worse still, an old file from 7 years ago showed that Elena's grandmother had once filed a complaint alleging that Harold and Janice had tried to transfer her retirement account into their own names. The claim was later withdrawn, and no one knew why. But now the pattern of behavior was unmistakable. It was no longer an isolated incident. Elena sat quietly in the leather chair, each breath heavy. Not just because of what had been done, but because of the truth she had to face. She had ignored too many warning signs. The help she once believed was unconditional. The phrase "we're family" she had clung to as an anchor during uncertain times. Now, it all felt like chains. Vanessa didn't let her sink too deep into that realization. "We're sending a cease and desist letter today," she said, flipping through legal clauses. "And I'm filing for an emergency restraining order within 48 hours. They've unlawfully entered your property, attempted to alter mortgage documents, and accessed your financial data. This is no longer a family matter. This is a serious legal violation." As Elena signed the first set of documents, her hand trembled. But beneath the dry legal language and official seals, something began to rise, a sense of autonomy no longer obscured by guilt or distorted notions of familial love. She would fight not for the house but for the right to exist as an independent person, no longer the product of anyone else's investment. 2 days later, under the escort of a police officer, Elena returned to her house for the first time since that harrowing night. Her hand gripped a new set of keys, quickly replaced after it was discovered the old lock had been tampered with. Her heart pounded not out of fear, but from a feeling difficult to name, something between deep hurt and simmering rage. When the door opened, the space inside appeared outwardly neat, but she quickly sensed the invisible changes pressing in. The sofa had been pushed to the side, the abstract painting she had bought from an independent artist had been removed from the wall. In her office, the desk drawer was ajar, and her financial files were no longer where she had left them. A faint handprint in the layer of dust on the desktop made her shiver. Officer Wilson documented every detail, his eyes filled with sympathy, but his demeanor strictly professional. They had no right to be here, and their presence clearly crossed a line. When he asked if she wanted to file for an emergency eviction should they return, Elena simply nodded. She didn't need more proof. What she needed was peace, the very thing her own parents had stripped away in a single deliberate act. Just as they stepped out of the house, her phone buzzed. A message from Nathan. "You're overreacting. Mom and Dad just wanted to help. Family is about sharing. Getting a lawyer involved is betrayal." Elena handed the phone to Officer Wilson. "Can you document this message?" she asked. He nodded. Every word was another piece of the larger puzzle, one where her family was no longer a refuge, but the source of an ongoing violation. That afternoon, Vanessa filed the request for a temporary restraining order with the court. But the situation didn't stop there. Elena received a call from her company. Her direct manager informed her that Harold had phoned the HR department asking to verify her income and current financial standing for the purpose of a family asset consolidation plan. Too outraged to stay quiet, Elena explained everything to her leadership team. To her surprise, they not only supported her, but also issued a formal notice warning her family that they were not permitted to contact or approach her workplace. That evening, as she lay on the worn-out bed at Talia's place, everything seemed to pour out in a single heavy exhale. She had once believed that if she stayed silent, if she tried hard enough, they would change. But the truth was, some people never stop until you build a wall, lock the door, and hold the key in your own hand. And this time, Elena knew with certainty she would never let go of that key again. The hearing took place in the oak-paneled courtroom of the Marston County Courthouse, where even the faintest sound echoed like a verdict. Elena entered with Vanessa, both dressed in dark suits, carrying a thick stack of documents containing all the evidence: the bank's phone call, the police report, the fabricated email sent to her company, and the manipulative messages from Nathan. On the other side, Harold sat upright, sharply dressed, but with a cold gaze. Janice wore a pale gray sweater, clutching a tissue tightly, while Nathan stood behind them like a shadow, silent, but with a bitterness he couldn't hide. No one greeted Elena. No one looked at her as a flesh-and-blood human being. They looked at her like an obstacle to be removed. The opposing counsel, a man named Roland Phelps with a perpetual smile and a voice smooth as silk, opened with a proposal for reconciliation. The family wishes to resolve this misunderstanding through joint therapy, and more importantly, to gain access to the house they believe they helped build from the ground up. Vanessa didn't respond with words, she simply slid the case file across the table. Attempting to seize property through fraudulent actions is a criminal offense. We do not reconcile with those who refuse to acknowledge their misconduct. Judge Lydia Monroe, a composed and sharp-minded woman in her 60s, of Hispanic descent, flipped through the file without expression. But each of her questions cut straight through the moral facade Harold and Janice had tried to construct. Did you contribute a single dollar to the down payment? Is your name on the deed? Is there a co-borrower agreement? One by one, the answers came. No. When it was Nathan's turn to speak, he repeated the familiar refrain, "I just wanted to help her organize her documents." Vanessa presented a photo taken by police, Nathan holding a box containing Elena's personal records, including her birth certificate, social security number, and bank statements. "Is this what you call helping?" the judge asked, her tone calm but icy. The hearing concluded with the court issuing a 90-day restraining order against all three, Harold, Janice, and Nathan, accompanied by a stern warning any further violation would lead to criminal prosecution. As they exited the courtroom, Janice called out softly, "Elena, you're tearing this family apart." But this time, Elena didn't turn around. She knew with certainty a real family doesn't ask you to sacrifice yourself just to preserve silence. 1 year after the trial ended, the house in Rose Hill looked entirely different, not just because of the fresh coat of soft blue-gray paint or the porch lights replaced with warm Edison bulbs, but because Elena had truly transformed it into a symbol of freedom, a living space built from old fractures and quiet courage. Every newly laid floor tile, every door with a changed lock, every picture rehung on the wall, stood as a statement this was her home, and no one had the right to demand it, claim it, or manipulate it. In the now expanded kitchen, ironically following the very open space design Nathan once mentioned, Elena cooked her first dinner for close friends, the ones who had stood by her during the darkest times, Talia Vanessa colleagues from Davenport Capital, and a few new faces from the support group for those who'd survived familial trauma. They clinked glasses, laughed loudly, and named the house Haven, a place of refuge. But wounds don't vanish as easily as court documents. At times, Elena still had nightmares, familiar voices echoing down the hallway, the sound of a key turning in the old lock, memories crashing into her chest like a blow. Once she ran into Nathan at the grocery store. He looked at her, lips pressed tight, then turned away. No words were exchanged, but Elena understood that was the look of someone who still refused to accept the truth. Harold and Janice quietly disappeared from her life. Through Aunt Anne, one of the few relatives who dared to take her side, Elena learned they had sold the old house and moved to a smaller town. No apology. No sign of remorse. They still saw her as the daughter who betrayed them. But for the first time, Elena didn't feel the need to explain or repair. She had chosen truth and freedom. That evening, alone in the living room, candlelight flickering against the wall where family photos once hung, Elena sat down and wrote a letter, not to send, but to close a chapter. She wrote, "I forgive, but I'm not returning. I wish you peace, but I choose to protect mine first. I owe no one my life." She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer as a final goodbye. What Elena chose to keep wasn't anger, but boundaries. And within those boundaries, for the first time in her life, she was truly living. Some wounds don't leave scars on the skin, but they etch themselves into how we see the world and ourselves. Elena had lost the family she once knew, but in return, she gained something she had never truly had: clarity. Clarity about her own worth, about the limits that are not negotiable, and about the kind of love no one should have to earn by bending themselves out of shape. In the house she had nearly lost, now remained only those who stayed out of respect, not entitlement. And that is what makes a home real. If this story made you reflect, if you've ever stood at the edge between family and your right to be yourself, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to continue following courageous journeys where pain doesn't end in defeat, but leads to a new life written with one's own hands. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to choose. And you are not alone.